I'm Sharon Marcus from the English department, also one of the editors of Public Books, which is one of the sponsors of tonight's reading, along with the Heyman Center for the Humanities, the Columbia Department of English and Comparative Literature, and the Coq du Pays Poetry of the American Avant-Garde Reading Series. And I organized this event with Michael Golston. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the event, and then Michael will introduce the speakers. Public Books, and I encourage all of you to go read it, the URL is publicbooks.org, is an online book review that started about 2 years ago, and it's dedicated to the proposition that academics and the arts can actually have a lot to say to each other. So when the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetics put out a new 2-volume edition, which caused a lot of ripples in the world of poetry scholars, I thought that it would be interesting to publish a response to it in Public Books that didn't involve professors weighing in a scholarly mode about what they thought of the new entry on the sonnet, but to have poets responding to the new edition whenever possible with poetry. Tonight's event is an extension and a broadening of that idea. Rather than having poets talk about a specific reference work, we thought we would ask poets to talk about the role that reference works play in their poetic process. How do reference works inspire them, aid them, provoke them, and provide really important lumbar support and act as footrests? So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Michael Golston, who will introduce the speakers, and then we will hear some poetry and poets on poetics. But where is Michael? Oh, there you are.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Golston from the English department, and I also curate the Coq du Pays Poetry of the American Avant-Garde Reading Series. And thanks for coming out on this chilly evening, and this really sounds like it's going to be great. I wanted to thank Sharon for inviting me to be part of this, and Eileen Galuli for the Heyman Center side of things, and hopefully we can do more of these kinds of collaborations in the future. Before we get started, though, I would like to let you all know what's coming up this semester for the reading series. We have a really exciting lineup. We have 3 readings that are coming up in the next couple months. On March 27th, Thursday, March 27th, we have Robert Grenier will be reading and showing his drawn poems along with Stephen Radcliffe from the West Coast. On Tuesday, April the 8th, we have Katie Degentesh will be reading along with our own Lytton Smith, who got his PhD here a couple of years ago and is a wonderful poet. And on Thursday, April 24th, we're going to have an evening of performance poetry, which should be really fun and great. It's Rodrigo Toscano and his collapsible Poetics Theater, and Julie Patton, who's a poet performer from down in the Bowery. So that should be really great. And we have a Tumblr site. Is that right, Paul? We have a Tumblr site, so you can see the schedule as it unfolds there. I'll also, if you're a Columbia person, I'll send out all kinds of information. So we hope people come. Those should be really interesting readings. Okay, so we're going to go down the line here. The poets will remain seated because this mic apparently is weird or something. So remain seated, and everybody gets 10 minutes to talk or read or do whatever they wish to about this topic. And I'm going to introduce them as they come up. So I'll introduce Dottie Lasky first, and then sit down, and then I'll do Ton, and so forth and so on, and we'll do it that way instead of doing them all at once. Okay, so I either know or have partied with everybody at the table here, except for our own Dottie Lasky. She's recently hired by Columbia. She's an assistant professor of poetry in the MFA program, and we're super thrilled to have her here. In fact, Charles Bernstein wrote me about her right after Christmas, and I just wanted to read what he said. He said, "Am very happy to hear that the Columbia MFA program has hired Dottie Lasky, who is married to our Buffalo Poetics PhD and terrific poet Tom Donovan. I got to know Dottie when she took a grad seminar with me as part of her education PhD at Penn. Like her very much." So that's praise from the master. I certainly hope to get to know her, and I'm hoping we can do some collaborations between the English department and the Fine Arts department. That would be great. Dottie is the author of 3 collections of poetry, Awe, Black Life, and Thunderbird, as well as several chapbooks, one of which is titled, provocatively, Poetry is Not a Project. I think many of us think that it is, but there you go. And most recently, she published Rome with Norton in this year, I guess. This fall. Oh, it will come out this fall. I see, okay. Her poems have appeared all over the place in New Yorker, Paris Review, American Poetry Review. She had a Bagley Wright Fellowship at Harvard in 2013. And I found this incredible statement on her Tumblr site. This is what it said. I am so pumped for this Dorothea Lasky lecture tonight. Fuck yes, poetry for now, for always. I thought that was wonderful. Anyway, so here she is, Dottie Lasky.
Well, it's great to be here and wonderful to be with these wonderful poets and very exciting. And I kind of interpreted, I hope I interpreted reference materials correctly, because I just interpreted my reference materials, so we'll see. So I just prepared about 100, 200 pages. I was told I'd have some blog time, so. When considering what to talk about this evening as my poetic reference materials, my first thought came to my love of Latin, particularly of what Latin has taught me about poetry so early on, as my first memory of really seeing myself as a poet was in 5th grade when my teacher, Mrs. Jane Hanlon, read our class excerpts from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Those stories were weird and wonderful and cut into my soul. Later in high school and then in college, I took Latin classes, and even in the midst of my poor translation skills, I remember telling myself, no, you aren't doing this to be a scholar of this language. You are doing this because this language will teach you how to be a poet. And certainly it did, because like the old saying goes, the fact that the order of words in Latin does not matter, or so they say, breeds in the mind the idea that the order of language in any sort of configuration does not matter. It may be that I have taken this lesson to heart. Later on as an MFA student, my wonderful teacher, Peter Gizzi, told me I really needed to check out the poetry of Bernadette Mayer. It was love at first glance of that purple butterfly book many of us lovingly know as the Bernadette Mayer Reader. Bernadette Mayer is one of my all-time favorite poets, and she too had a great love of Latin, translating poems that comprise in part her book, The Formal Field of Kissing, which was out of print for a while, but can now be found through Monk Books. In all of her poetry, Mayer employs a perfect line. Her lines are fair in every sense of that word. It is as if she assumes that you need to know things to move on in the poem, and you are a smart person. But she doesn't write poems that try to trick you into thinking anything you don't want to. They are a lot like objective reality in that way, although in the best sense of that idea. The declarative sentence, but not. I might argue that such a sense of the line comes from a close study of Latin syntax through an English language lens. At least from my skewed perspective, this is how I've always seen her work. When you translate a line of Latin poetry, you realize how malleable syntax actually is, how arbitrary and yet deathly important are the words we put together, and likewise separate within a line of a poem in any language. Each word becomes a tiny moving object, a series of planets changing forever in the poem's sky. Mayer is always displaying this fundamental principle of poetry. A poet that Mayer often translated in her Formal Field of Kissing is Catullus, a Roman poet, a poet with a metaphysical eye. One of my favorite Catullus poems is the title poem of her book, number 48. Mayer changes the poem in such a way that it is an endless source of fuel for my own poems. And here's a translation from Peter Green, which is a more standard translation of the poem. And he writes, "Oh, those honey-sweet eyes of yours, Juventius, if they'd let me kiss them all I'd wanted, I'd go on 300,000 times and never feel I was getting near my limit, even though our crop of osculations ended tighter packed than dried out wheat ears." I remember translating Catullus's version of the poem from the Latin when I was 18. I think it was a hot day in early fall, and I was obsessed with some guy. I can't even remember his name now. And I got caught up in how many kisses there were. How many kisses are 300,000 really? The kisses, of course, are endless, like lust, like heat, like love. There is a totality of love that one might never have enough. Certainly in the best cases, that's how it feels, doesn't it? And here's the mayor's translation. I'd kiss your eyes 300,000 times if you would let me, Juventius, kiss them all the time, your darling eyes, eyes of honey. And even if the formal field of kissing had more kisses than there's corn in August fields, I still wouldn't have had enough of you. In the Catullus poem, he connects his feeling to a never-ending harvest of corn, but nowhere do I see the formal field of kissing that Mare brings in. By doing so, she adds a level of insatiability that goes beyond Catullus. In her poem, it is not only to be for forever unfulfilled by heat, that is never enough with longing, but to be insatiable for the sensual word. After all, not only kisses but words will never be enough to explain how we feel, and still we poets continue to try to do so anyway. In my third book, Thunderbird, I did my own translation of this poem, using both texts as reference materials, but of course trying to make my own poem. And this poem I called Why Go in Cars? Why go in cars? They can be destroyed. I don't want to be destroyed by you. I love you and your want. We don't need cars. Why don't we sit in a sea of violets? I could kiss you 1,000,000 times and never be sick of it. Let's go sit in some flowers, darling boy. Let's sit in a sea of flames, and I will never put the fire out of you. I don't know if mentioning Catullus poems as a sort of reference material is a kind of slant to this conversation tonight that is too skewed. Still, I bluster on in thinking that the particular structure of Latin and the fact that it is the only language I have ever truly studied make it an endless encyclopedia to my work. Perhaps it is not just the language but the feelings of Catullus I use as source. To cut up the feelings of the day into tiny pieces, or more so to take the scraps of feelings and make them into a beautiful dress, as Sylvia Plath's daughter wrote that her mother did in her introduction to the iteration of Ariel that was published a few years ago. Catullus makes a scrap of feelings to make my dresses because he fills his poems with both hate and love. Take, for example, his poem number 43, and this is a Peter Green translation. Hi there, girl with a nose by no means tiny, non-dark eyes and two most undainty ankles, not long fingers and undry lips, besides a tongue that's far from overly refined. You bankrupt from Formai's mistress. Does the province spread word that you're attractive? Do men pick on you to compare my Lesbia with now? Oh, this tasteless age, ill-bred and witless. Here Catullus dresses down a poor big-nosed girl, telling her she has a bad case of the cankles, seemingly just for the sake of it. It is unclear if this is a revenge poem to this girl for a possible rejection, or if his purpose all along was to write a love poem for his beloved Lesbia. I have just finished my fourth book, which I incidentally called Rome, and in it I do about 2.75 translations of Roman poetry, and one of them is number 43 by Catullus, so I will share it with you now. And it's called Never Did Amount to Anything. Hi there, dear sister, I'm sad, but here to tell you that you never did amount to anything. Facial expressions just like your mother. Nose by no means tiny. Married a couple of people, so now you sit in a house, cleaning or not cleaning a window. Newsflash, no one cares about time, but you do it like it's so moral being punctual. Truly an actress, but you poorly acted the part of someone who isn't crazy. No, I can't say your ankles are fat, but dear lady, who would have had your ass? Except now I do, seemingly connected we are, in the worst way. And so I must tell you, you are a no-good person, a criminal, really, a scoundrel. No, really a liar. He said the person was cold, maybe a bit disdainful. I said, welcome to my life. You know, some people like history or want to make history, but I am history. If you would have fucked me, I would have been okay being Plath, but instead I'm Sexton. If somebody asks me what I like, it's not food or sex, it's looking at things and being in love. Not sure what of this you did offer me. Never did amount to anything. So with this, I go. Shifting gears here, I thought I might tell you about another textual source of inspiration when I first found my voice, as they say. I know I hate that phrase too. When I had just moved to Boston about 10 years ago after graduating from an MFA program. In Harvard Square, there is usually a group of religious zealots, and for a while when I first moved there, I would see these people with a million tracts, and I started collecting them, emulating their voice in my poems and way of speaking loudly when I was giving readings. Let me share with you a poem from my first book, Awe, that used these texts as source materials, and it's called Dear Friend. Dear friend, it has come to my attention that your soul is in need of saving. Well, with all of your vice and your scorn. You spend a lot of time doing bad things, don't you? You might be asking yourself, how can I get into heaven? The truth is, there is no way. There is no heaven. The answer to man's most asked question, therefore, has no answer. Let me tell you a story. There was an elephant once named Jesus. He was full of blood. There was blood on his face and on his head and on his body. His gray body would get all bloody and then get even more gray with all the dried blood. His skin felt like wet parchment, and I'll tell you a secret. I knew a little girl who would draw on him. Then death came and killed the little girl and the elephant. Friend, did that make little sense? Let me tell you something else. The Bible says the wages of sin is death, and William Blake says a spirit and a vision are not a cloudy vapor or a nothing. Your spirit is in danger, sinner. You do not know your body is your spirit. The spirit on your tongue is full of water. The ball of fire in the sky is your heart on fire in your chest. Friend, we are entering an apocalypse. That apocalypse is called lack of divine image. This apocalypse has crushed our very general heart and is in danger of crushing our very specific one. You might ask, what can I do? Well, here's what. Take the exit nothingness 75 off the freeway. Give in to yourself and oppress the law. Art is in danger, my brother and sister, and sadly, you are in danger with it. There is a rose for dividing water. Divide the water. Deeply concern yourself with this, or the effect will be circular. Take the rose and put it in your chest, then put your chest in the sun. I'm serious. Without your help, no one will be saved. There will be no water. The earth is dying as we speak. So start now. God waits for no one. Signed, the Eternal Damned. Yet another source of source materials related to my love of conversation is my obsessive listening, especially while running or maneuvering the subway, of pop songs, lifting these lyrics often as text to directly steal from. I love the fact that a pop song is meant for a wide audience, and I've always wanted to write poems for the widest possible audience. Some have said that my poetic voice can seem simple. It is painstakingly so, and for this reason. When I told my friend Adam about this event, he said, make sure you mention your jewelry, which in my typical fashion I met with stubborn annoyance at anything wise he suggests, telling him, please, these people don't mean that. But maybe it is worth mentioning. I have an ongoing obsession with plastic jewelry, definitely now vintage, but more art resin, that started when I was 7 when I went with my mother to the safety deposit box and accidentally broke her beloved mother's Bakelite pin. It was a very big deal, and it started my thinking that all plastic jewelry is sacred. It does have a body-like quality, absorbing scents and touches and memory. And of course, a piece of plastic as jewelry is a kind of text I draw from. I spend at least 82% of every day thinking about plastic jewelry. Right now I have about 3, maybe 4 top plastic jewelry designers that I am into. I will always love a designer named R. Sobral, having first found one of his monochromatic India Jones necklaces in the St. Louis Art Museum. These necklaces are like wearing Louise Nevelson sculptures, and when you have them all together, it looks as if you are carrying the rainbow everywhere. But a secret rainbow, despite his white popularity in everywhere but America. Another designer I really like is Alexis Bitar, who has a studio in Brooklyn, and I want to go. He layers glitter, usually golden color, with a strip of colored paint, and then carefully carved round forms. Oh, when the color he picks is neon, it could command my attention for a trillion hours. The pieces look lit from within. Another favorite is the Florentine designer Angela Caputi, a ferocious Virgo, who makes such big earrings their presence sounds like a big bursting bugle horn. Her pieces make me feel human. I don't really drink, but last weekend I found myself in Western Mass after giving a reading, and after about 3 vodka drinks, I had this vivid memory of walking on the cobbled streets near Caputi's shop on the Via Danto Spirito, whoops, I just mispronounced that completely, last summer, wearing these big, unreal, coral-formed clip-ons with black rhinestones and specks of almost gold within the fake coral. Feeling the most alive I have probably felt in a very long time. As real a source for a poem as anything I could ever read in words. What the thought that was of a drunk narcissist, but of course, it is true. I could read you some poems right now, especially from my book Black Life, which mentions some of my Sorbo pieces directly, and also Bakelite, but I think I may be over time already. What that could have elucidated is that I think in my darkest book, I'm focusing on what brings me real distraction, i.e. real pleasure, the divine rhetoric of poetry. Sometimes when I feel most like things are most meaningless, I look to a plastic bangle to save me. Maybe that's what I am doing with all of these texts, trying to find the pleasure source that saves the utter core chord out. Whatever the case, for me and plastic, it's endless. It's probably time to stop this. Thank you very much for listening.
All right. Okay. Number 2 is Tan Lin. Tan is also one of ours, or was one of ours. He did his PhD here at Columbia in 1995. And he's presently an associate professor of English and creative writing at New Jersey City University. He's been a visiting poet in residence at the California Institute of the Arts in Valencia, California, and he taught at the University of Virginia also. He has, his latest books are, or his books are Lotion Bullwhip Giraffe, Bib, that's B-I-B, Heath Course Pack, Insomnia and the Aunt, 7 Controlled Vocabularies, and Obituary, 2004, The Joy of Cooking. And the latest is an annotated index to the photographic work of Diana Kingsley. And I think did that appear in Convolution? Yes. Yeah, that appeared in Convolution. He's also a video artist, and he does theatrical and LCD work. They've been shown at the Marianne Bosky Gallery, the Yale Art Museum, Sophienholm Museum in Copenhagen, Ontological Hysterical Theater, and as part of the Whitney Museum of American Art Soundcheck series. He got a Getty Distinguished Scholar Grant for 2004 and 2005, and a Warhol Foundation Creative Capital Arts Writing Grant to complete a book-length study of the writings of Andy Warhol. According to his website, his principal aim in the past 15 years has been to produce an ambient literature, centered around, but not confined to, sampling, communal production, and social networks, and treating issues as diverse as relaxed copyright, boredom, plagiarism, and the commodification of attention. So let's get our attentions commodified. Please welcome Tan Lin.
Thank you very much. I was at Columbia, I got a PhD. It took me 15 years. I think I set a record. As I tell everyone, after about 7 years, bibliography start to get kind of sexy. So I'm glad we're talking about reference works today. And I was looking through my library. You know, I buy, and maybe this has changed for everyone, but when I need a book, I used to go to the library and get it, but now I'm too lazy, so when I need a book, I just order it. But of course, this causes a problem. I have too many books, and I don't really know how to get rid of them. So I've become a bookseller, too. So whenever I'm done with the book, I have to sort of sell the books on Amazon or I have. But one of the books that I used early on for my first book, which was called Lotion Bowl of Giraffe, is Walker's Rhyming Dictionary. And this is actually not my book. It's a book that I found on my mother's shelves. So I started writing poetry when I was in maybe junior high school or high school. And my mother had studied poetry with Theodore Roethke at UW. And so she has this book. It's called Walker's Rhyming Dictionary. And it's a beautiful book. And I used it religiously, actually, when I wrote my first book, which was Lotion Bowl of Giraffe, which was about generating, or machine generating, as much language as I could. But just to put you into a kind of poetic mood, I thought I'd read from Walker's Rhyming Dictionary. The print is extremely small, so. Accredit, discredit, bandit, pundit, audit, plaudit, albeit, howbeit, deceit, conceit, counterfeit, forfeit, surfeit, Fahrenheit. No, and there, it's kind of hot up here. More recently, I've been interested in, I mean, it was said that maybe the body was envisaged in the 19th century as a kind of thermodynamic engine that burns glucose and fat and protein, but now the body is seen as a kind of information gate or manager. So I've been very interested in sort of managing information at a sort of personal level. And you know, we sort of maybe think of ourselves as data that needs to be constantly enumerated and updated today. But one thing I became interested in was the sort of concept of gray literature. These are works that are published, you know, not by official publishing houses, pamphlets, brochures, preprints, scientific research that goes into the publication of a citationable article. And these are difficult to track. They're difficult to to find. And they're often circulated among people who don't want to circulate them or to acknowledge that they've read them. So this is a book called Gray Literature, Information Sources in Gray Literature, 4th edition. And I ordered it like a week and a half ago, and it came in the mail. It's a used book, and I was extremely happy because it comes from the Ohio State University Science and Engineering Library. So it's an old library book. And I was kind of pleased to note that it's never been checked out. So I have a pristine copy here. But just to change the mood a little bit, I'll read a little bit about the description of what gray literature is. So in some ways I feel like, I wrote the first book sort of under the sign of rhyming dictionaries, and I wrote all my later books under the sign of Google search and the various kinds of search engines and information management. And when I was at the Getty, I was writing a book on Warhol and his print production, and I met a woman there who was sort of instrumental in setting up the object ID system, which is a controlled vocabulary system for describing objects as they're transferred from one institution to another, from country to country. So it enables you to talk, say, about a tabouret in France and understand that that's a stool in parts of Southern America. So, but anyway, here's a definition of gray literature. The first question to address is, what exactly does the gray literature embrace in terms of documents? In an earlier book in the present series, Chillag, 1985,
gives Wood's widely quoted definition of gray literature as, quote, literature which is not readily available through normal bookselling channels and therefore difficult to identify and obtain. This definition first appeared in a survey of the British Library Lending Division's Role in Handling Gray Literature, Wood, 1982. Examples of gray literature include reports, technical notes and specifications, conference proceedings and preprints, supplementary publications and data compilations, trade literature, and so on. It has to be recognized, however, that not all material in all these categories is gray in the sense defined above. Conference proceedings may ultimately be published as books or journals, whilst many official publications eventually become commercially available and easy to acquire through normal book-selling channels. Uncertain availability is only one characteristic of gray literature. Others include poor bibliographic information and control, non-professional layout and format, and low print runs. So I went to Wikipedia and I looked up gray literature. And one of the subheadings under there was a category called Malin gray literature, which is material that's supposedly designed to, well, it's printed on fugitive materials and it's supposed to destroy itself. So then I looked up Malin gray literature in, just doing a Google search, and only 3 references come up, and both say that the category of Malin gray literature doesn't actually exist. Somebody had tracked the entry in Wikipedia of Malin gray to some sort of fugitive source. It seems to be invented by someone who wanted to just create this fugitive category within the Wikipedia entry on gray literature. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit from 7 Controlled Vocabularies. And the book went out of print about, I guess, 3 months ago, and Susanna Tamminen at Wesleyan said, oh, do you want to revise it or just reprint it? And I said, oh, why don't we just do a revision? So, and I'm interested in sort of the life that a book has over a good many years, and that it changes and that its publication horizon is altered as it's reread and read in different ways. So I'm just going to read 3 short entries from the revised version and 1 older entry. So the first entry is a restaurant review that I did of a restaurant called WD50. And the book that I wrote, 7 Controlled Vocabularies, was really about the sort of diffusion of literature into sort of soft categories, such as restaurant reviews, status updates, all those sorts of things. This is called RPT. What is the relation between a fruit and a vegetable? A book transpires 1 letter and then 1 word at a time, and nothing about reading can prevent this from happening. For this reason, books are best diluted or read over a good many years. Only things that are consumed endure beyond their shelf life. Nothing is really very different if you say it is. I had dinner yesterday at WD50, which is a restaurant located where the new Fukinese area of Chinatown and the old pickle shops of the defunct Lower East Side almost come into alignment. The restaurant is located at 50 Clinton Street, and it has a post-craftsman style decor with bulbous glass lamps that look like fluorescent flower bulbs. The chef's name is Wiley Dufresne. He is young and he looks like a cowboy reincarnated as a skateboarder. His father, Dewey, is also a chef. WD50 is probably the only restaurant in Manhattan that makes you hallucinate the food you are eating while you are eating it. The food can be unfood-like. I ate at the restaurant a few nights ago, and afterwards my taste buds felt incongruous and ecstatic. I remember seeing something on another table that looked like dessert, and I ordered it. A few moments later, there were bonbon-sized bits of pineapple on a plate. They had been soaked in something briny and had become pickles. Off to one side of the fruit was smeared what looked like hot fudge sauce, except that it was made of ketchup and jalapeno peppers. The sauce was semi-frozen. The sauce was hot and cold and hot. I couldn't tell which. I put the pineapple in my mouth, and it was like eating something that had been a vegetable. The chef had sprinkled some salt, scented with what looked like dour chips of limes. It was not really necessary to eat the food. One could breathe it. When I put all this in my mouth, I tasted so many things I forgot what was in my mouth. Eating at WD-50 is like reading Proust backwards. I looked over at a man at the table next to ours, and he had the face of a 6-year-old. The ideas of food erase the food itself and then become the food you did not think you were eating. Time passes inordinately or not at all. What is it like to eat an idea or its suggestion? As anyone who has eaten can tell you, the most beautiful memories are memories that one has forgotten how to have. Eating at WD-50 is like having psychoanalysis with a starch, a sugar, or a fat. So this is a later entry, and it's basically about data management within a sort of literary system. And this is called ISQ 8879. Today's highly absorptive and interminable data templates are indistinguishable from the interminable data of life itself. Having a self, like accumulating friends on Facebook or remembering a loved one's birthday, is a function of data aggregation and management. The personal is a mathematical function where every human memory is a lesson in bureaucracy. As anyone who has lived her life online can tell you, individuals are forensically incomplete and demand continual data enumeration and tagging. In other words, having a self is an anachronism marked by a lack of clarity and poor predictive capacity. Today, all selves aspire to the principal apparatus of the jurisprudential, the vertical filing system. As T.S. Eliot noted, the poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality. All algorithms of desiring are lyrical by design. What is a sweater or spouse? An algorithm for something we like. Hence the mildly effervescent Platonic phrase, "You are so algorithmic." As any data harvester can tell you, cultivating your ephemeral data is the principal means of falling in love or transitioning to adulthood. People without data never grow up. As any novelist or poet who has spent time on Facebook can tell you, life is a well-tended public data field without causality violations or distributional flaws. Most of our data is amorous. Historical throwbacks, 19th century genealogical charts, and the yellow pages tossed on your doorstop. More recent, your unmonitored spam box, or the hacked accounts of 75 million target customer numbers exchanged on black markets in November 2013. Thank you.
Thank you, Ton. Our next speaker reader is Nada Gordon. She is a founding member of the Flarf Collective, if you know what the Flarf Collective is. I think of her as NG Flarfiste, kind of like HD Imagiste. Huh? And when I asked her what she would like me to say, she wanted to let us know that she's interested in the lyric subject as zombie clown. Her 7 books of poetry include Vile Lit, Scented Rushes, Vile Lilt, that even says Vile Lilt. Scented Rushes, Folly, The Imp, Foreign Body, and my favorite, which is Are Not Our Lowing Heifers Sleeker Than Night-Swollen Mushrooms? She teaches English as a foreign language at Pratt Institute, is originally from California, lives in Brooklyn, and she's presently at work on a holographic memoir of the lyric clown as zombie subject. Nada Gordon.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? So thank you for coming through the slush to be in our verbal slush. I guess I want to start with something I saw on Twitter the other day that I thought was relevant to this topic. And it was a retweet of a quote by a poet I've never heard of, Ed Pavlich. Maybe you guys know who he is. Anyway, he said, "A poet doesn't get words out of a dictionary. He or she gets them out of then there's an ellipsis, the wager one makes with one's time in history. And I thought that sounded very grand and high-flown, but not really quite true. I remember when I took my first creative writing class at San Francisco State University in 1982 with the great poet Stephen Rotifer. The first question he asked us was, where do you get your language? And although, I think, even then at however old I was, 18, 19, I was kind of hip to the poeticity of the world and Dada and, various forms of appropriation and other modes, I hadn't really thought about how that might work for poetry. I was still sort of stuck in, Plath, Cummings, Yeats, and that whole sort of nexus of writing. And I think it was the second class, and actually, Dottie, it's interesting, this goes back to you. He gave us a Xerox copy of a page from a dictionary of Latin phrases, common Latin phrases used in English with their translations, and he said, make a poem. And so I did. I made a kind of a he-she dialogue, and I was hooked to this method of making stuff. And so I guess my definition of what a reference book is kind of extremely broad. I don't know that it's between hard covers or soft covers. It's certainly electronic, and it does include a rhyming dictionary. Other kinds of sources that I use are literal old dusty dictionaries, a catalog do you guys remember in the Flatiron there was the Gordon Novelty Shop where you could buy like clown wigs and fake buttocks and things like that? Do you remember that? It's now defunct, but I felt like they had built that store for me. And they had this wonderful catalog full of copy, which fills especially one of my books, Folly, which is very concerned with like the absurd and burlesque. But I think that, my involvement with Flarf, you guys know what Flarf is? Should I give you a brief, brief something? Okay.
It's in the Princeton Encyclopedia now.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm going to talk about it here.
Okay, well.
But just for a little bit.
All right. And basically, Flarf is an impudent attitude towards the literary, and that involved lots of different techniques of poem making. But the one that became most famous was poems that were generated from Google searches. So although Flarf is not exclusively confined to Google search poems, that was one of the ways that we created our work. But even now, that my work has once again sort of gone on its more lyric path, I still use a lot of reference works that you might not think of as traditional reference work. So for example, if you just input the word list as one word into a Google search, you will see the most absolutely luscious, bewilderingly luscious lists of beautiful vocabulary. So I just have a couple of examples here of the kinds of things that simple Google search will turn up. Latents, metaphysics, clamorers, assignat, salesmen, dilatedly, fermentation, joule, Talmudist, architects, absinthism, bossa, boutiques, toxicologic, periphrastically, few, scorper, scenarioization, and so on. I could really feel myself getting completely just sensuously lost in these things. But I don't really think that it's enough to just print that out and call that your book. Personally, I want something that's more motivated, either by my own agenda or something I'm thinking about. So, an example, not of a word list poem, but of a dusty dictionary poem would be one that is in vile lilt. And I had a coworker who hated me, and I could never figure out why she hated me. But I was always like, she was worked in the next office, and I was always getting this sort of contempt through the wall. And I felt like I needed some way to deal with all that negativity, and sort of my rage response to that negativity, because it didn't seem fair. So I opened a dusty dictionary, and I started to create a poem out of the definitions. And what I like about this method is that it becomes this sort of accrual of nesting of positives. It's almost like guano building up, and the poem becomes very complex. So this is called Poem to My Enemies. So I guess I was thinking of more than one. It's a funky brown day on the Grand Karoo, bitter and disputed, determined by a priori categories of the mind whose nut or kernel conceals the innermost part or central fort of a medieval castle. Literally, I am going down in your esteem by chopping blows delivered with the side of an open hand, like an assembly of ridge-like parts that scolds as harshly as a lock nut or disputed clasp. There between Novaya Zemlya and western Siberia, in a dry silk cotton desert near the Chinese border, wander all the little caracoles, a sheep of Central Asia whose newborn lambs exude a wool loosely curled and usually black, also called caracol, a cousin, one would guess, of Astrakhan. Held in custody, held back, restrained like a kia, the large green parrots that kill lambs whose wool is loosely curled and usually black, by tearing at their backs to eat the flesh there. I am stirred well or poorly by these metal plates, fastened over and over and poked with cathodes in the strongest innermost part. So it kind of goes on along this way. It was kind of astonishing to me how I could find all of this violence and harshness just because I was projecting my feelings onto the dictionary. Or maybe the dictionary was projecting its feelings onto me, I don't know. So another way that I might use reference works is to use concordances. So in 1998, I found myself embroiled in a very long distance love correspondence. And I was in Tokyo, and the guy I was corresponding with was here in Brooklyn. And there weren't many books in the school where I worked, but there was this like really fusty book about Milton, John Milton. And it included a concordance of his language. And the really cool thing about Milton is that he was an extraordinary neologist, and he would just pull words out of his whatever. And so I created a love poem using the words from Milton's vocabulary, and it's titled maybe sort of uncreatively phone sex, because that's basically what it was about. So, in deflourishing alone, my belly embranded with your elonging, a dust with your handprint, your gaze azurne, moistured cataphracts all conglobed in plenipotent love. In paradise we phone, concoctive, even after jaculation. If you will be my conflagrant, I will be your paranymph, all murrine in my arborous mewings, completely glibbed by you, immanacled, then enslumbered, in nocent elamping, wholly, perfectly engladded. And then I just want to share one other way that I use reference works, and it's kind of pedestrian. I like to write songs sometimes, and for a song, you need rhymes to really make it work if it's going to sound poppy. And so this was an adjustment of a flarf poem that I wrote that I decided to put into rhyming lyrics and fit to the tune of Josephine Baker's De temps en temps. So, When I hear this in my mind, I hear it in 2 or 3 part harmony. So if anybody wants to join me, you can feel free. And you don't mind, right? You'll indulge me in the singing of this song, right?
It depends on
All right.
your voice.
All right. Well, you can gong me if you want. Anyway,
Have you found your voice?
have I found my voice? That is the question. So the song is "She Sure Likes the Cream." Oh, pussycat, oh, fluffy kitten, she's a furry semiotic machine, a rabid, glass-eyed princess with her cunning kitty dreams. Oh, dreamy girl, oh, moody sweetie, she's the man who would be queen. Pussycat don't like the soup, but she sure likes the cream. She believes our anxieties are so meretricious, or like electric ferrets, darling little cat heads with pretty little bows. Moonshine, lady sugar, and blue bubbles, a belabored metaphor in pantyhose. Oh, pussycat, oh, fluffy kitten, she's an animal mujahideen, a one-eyed voodoo goddess with a clashing color scheme. Oh, dreamy girl, oh, moody sweetie, she's a feline wolverine. Pussycat don't like the soup, but she sure likes the cream. She believes our society is too fabulicious, like a chaotic parrot, howling little sack butts in simulated mind. Moonshine, lady sugar, and blue bubbles, she's the emblem of a culture in decline. I'm not done. La, 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 la. Pussycat don't like the soup, but she sure likes the cream. But thank you.
One more time, Nada. Our next speaker is Bob Perelman, probably still best known as a language poet, though I'm not sure that really matters anymore. Of course it matters. He's a fantastic poet, also a playwright, a great editor, a scholar, and a translator, I found out recently. He teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's the author of at least 14 books of poetry, as well as other sorts of tracts and so forth. His latest book is called If Life, from Roof Books in 2006, and his selected poems came out recently. They're called 10 to 1, really great selection of Bob's poetry. He was the editor of Writing Talks in 1985, which I think was one of the most important collections of poet talks, at least for my generation. We sort of grew up on that stuff. And he's the author of 2 great scholarly works, one of which is called The Trouble with Genius, and the other one is The Marginalization of Poetry. These are really important studies of poetry that's sort of off the beaten track, I guess you might say. Well, I don't know, pound. Anyway, and he has another one on the way at some point called Modernism, the Morning After. So welcome, Bob Perelman.
Well, thank you. Thanks for being here. So this is a very funny, it's very fusty and fraught subject, actually, for me. I, too, have used reference works and done many things like that. But I'm now speaking from a recent experience of getting I thought it was a one-volume Princeton Encyclopedia. I only got one, anyway. What's in the second one? I thought it went to Z, but anyway. And it was, I wrote a piece about it that was in the Public Books website. I'm going to read that and talk about it a little bit. But I felt rather than reference works being a cornucopia of various kinds of vocabulary displacement and riches of vocabulary, I found a kind of inimical relation between poetry, the still live impulse to write, say something new, interesting to myself, pleasurable, and the closing in of the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetics and how dense it was, how the contention for space was so remarkable. I mean, I would have brought it. I just came from Philly and teaching, and got on the train, and the book, what I think of as the one volume, it's too big. I mean, I just didn't want to bring it along. I would have needed a rolling suitcase for it. And yet it's very, there's a finality and a necessary miserliness in every moment of it. The print is small, the leading is small, abbreviations are rife. They're just trying to cram everything in. It's a kind of the Noah's Ark of what was poetry. I felt there was a real kind of tension that reference works are, to some extent, just what I don't. They're kind of an enemy to writing, although one can't help but use them, and there's no such thing as I don't mean to counterpoise that to natural language, which is just a little desert island that we're all each individually on, or so that's not the happy ending. Anyway, just to sort of throw that little bit of angst out, I guess, to kind of curdle a little drop of lemon in Pussy's milk somehow. Anyway, just had to do it. Okay, so first I'm going to read this. The Sublime in Inches, Avant-Garde Poetics and the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, 4th edition. 1. Proem. That is no object for an older sensorium or a tired one. 2 columns of print, small font, tightly leaded, the lang, compact, abreve where pos, poised at the edge of legibility, the struggle for space, never giving the eye an inch of rest, 1,000 words a page, printed on acid-free paper, as if the acknowledged legislators were aiming for eternity. 2. How heavy the book is. Though I swim and climb stairs and all, still, to pick it up with hand and forearm grip is not a task to be undertaken lightly. Product dimensions, 2.1 by 7 by 10 inches, shipping weight, 5.7 pounds. Encyclopedias, like poems, have 2 primary tasks, to inspire and to instruct. Their comic flaw is having to be open to the present. Think hospital gown. It's a funny definition of the present, I guess, what to say. When I was 5 in Ohio, I remember jumping from couch to chair, trying not to touch the floor, ocean, hurling a rubber knife at selected targets, acting as instructed/inspired by the heavy brown leather volume 3, ball 4 to both, of the Encyclopedia Britannica, open to the spread of photos of battleships. Bliss it was above that watery floor, to be possessed of such sublime distinctions. Dreadnought, not cruiser, not destroyer, not escort. Nothing was anything I knew before, and now everything flowered together into a single knowing/acting amid the exuberance of these differing names of power, inextricably the direction of contemporary and historic particulars. Thwack. 2. Object lesson. The 4th edition of the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics continues to rely on the alphabet to pour oil on the contentions of its audience. There is no narrative. The alphabet is the demiurge who has so ordered matters that auxasis, ascending order, I may, I must, I can, I will, I do, comes before avant-garde poetics, and Aztec poetry, see Indigenous Americas, poetry of the, follows. Yet the title itself transgresses this decorous parataxis, since poetics should take alphabetic precedence over poetry, if only at the 5th letter. Putting poetry first acknowledges the obvious. It is poetry that is the primary practice. Poetry is the only begetter of poetics, as well as its horizon of adjudication. But it is also obvious that poetry is seldom to be encountered on the pages of TPEP, I think it was the abbreviation that was agreed on, TPEP. Poetry is seldom to be encountered on the pages of TPEP, which are almost 100% poetics, tightly corded prose. And given the contention for articulate space, how could the designers have acted otherwise, facing the specter of poetry's spatial luxuriating, its compact singularities twerking or otherwise posturing down the page, so few words taking up so much valuable real estate? So that when on page 524, at the end of the article free verse, a complete poem erupts, James writes spring images. 2 athletes are dancing in the cathedral of the wind. A butterfly lights on a branch of your green voice. Small antelopes fall asleep in the ashes of the moon. One feels the ineffectuality of the particular with a real pang. Was it for this that hundreds of words of thoughtful, abbreviated mention were shouldered aside? The real question is, who gets how many inches? And then I measured everything and added them up. Avant-garde poetics, 59.5 column inches. Beat poetry, 13.5. Black Mountain School, 12. Black Arts Movement, 14.25. Conceptual poetry, 15.25. Dada, 28.5. Flarf, 4. Sorry. Futurism, 47.25. Harlem Renaissance, 21.5. Hip-hop poetics, 14.75. Imagism, 21.5. Language poetry, which I want to register a protest, it should be language writing, but it's language poetry, and I don't care anyway, because I'm not mentioned in that article. So I guess there's your answer, Michael. Language poetry, writing, I'll say, 33.25. New York School, 18.5. Objectivism, 14.75. Oulipo, 20.75. The entries in TPEP, the preface tells us, on page Roman numeral 7, are fivefold. Terms and concepts, genres and forms, periods, schools and movements, collectivities, relations to other practices. Some entries, philosophy and poetry, science and poetry, to name 2, are to me, as a poet, a little bit inspiring. Not jumping around on the couch throwing a rubber knife inspiring, but bringing to mind shards of the big questions and piquing the desire to write. But the measured entries I've listed above are something else. There, I'm an interested party, a component of various selfish memes jostling for space in the war of all against all. I read to see who's mentioned and check out the formulations. Okay, I'm going to read it. Okay, it's just not that long. 3, avant-garde poetics, or 59.5. Through no fault of any of its users, avant-garde has become what Empson might call a complex word, something rather unaerodynamic. In the face of this, Marjorie Perloff's entry gathers the necessary parts: the prehistory of the term, its military political implications, a perspicacious discussion of the osmotic boundaries dividing and connecting modernism and the avant-garde, state-of-the-art capsule summaries of Dada, Italian, and Russian futurism, citation and refutation of Peter Berger's theory of the avant-garde, etc. I'm skipping a little. And I'm going to say at the end that my own very different take on the avant-garde, where in the recent article, which in New Literary History, I write as a poet frustrated by the increasing conventionality of the avant-garde. I deny none of the history of the term, and would happily have referred to Perloff's capsule histories, but find that, as a writer in the present, the avant-garde is a too happy fairy tale. We will have been ahead of our time, and we will therefore live happily ever after. The more avant-garde poetics are reified, known in advance, the more doxological. Juliana Sparr's catalog in her book, The Transformation, has, to my ear, the right note of world weariness, and she repeats this phrase in a kind of Steinian manner about 10, 12 times in this long prose book. This is what she learned at Buffalo: fragmentation, quotation, disruption, disjunction, agrammatical syntax, and so on. Okay, then Perloff is aware of both the persistence and the dilution of the avant-garde as it meets the present. It is unlikely that the term avant-garde will disappear anytime soon. On the contrary, it remains the key descriptor of the new, the unfamiliar, the daring, and the provocative. Indeed, in public parlance, accordingly, avant-garde means little more than chic or in. In the entry's conclusion, she emphasizes continuity. Quote, while no manifesto today is going to matter, as did Marinetti's of 1909, if we go back to the original definition of avant-garde as ahead of its time, its staying power is evident. Avant-gardism, it seems, appeals to our continuing belief that, in reconstituting the world of poetry and art, quote, it must change. And then I say, my friendly amendment to this would be to push back on any automatic association of the avant-garde with futurity. The back and forth with prior example is too frequent. One can revivify the scare-quoted ahead of its time only by going back to an original definition and ending with a praise phrase from late Wallace Stevens, it must change, is hardly a gesture of temporal procession. And then I say, I think about Perloff, that she's often, her gaze is very wide, takes in century-wide vistas, Levi-Leto and T.S. Eliot, for instance, in Unoriginal Genius. More than a guardian of an ever-advanced avant-garde, she needs to be seen as a force for historic, or let's just say, live poetry. So I'm being very, I'm saying yes to live, interesting poetry, and I'm no to the avant-garde doxologies. Okay, I'm going to just read one poem that came from Old English. One of my colleagues at Penn does this Old English live night where her class translates stuff, and then she gives us, me and Charles and Herman Beavers, and when she was there, Susan Stewart, something, and says, write a poem about this, which is kind of good. So this is, I'm taking this someplace in Beowulf that I never managed to finish the Old English that she passes out, but it doesn't matter, it's interesting anyway. And it's about, I won't say any more. I then reused this in a reading about the Hurricane Sandy. So it's now called Sandy Lines. So just to show you that, these things are very portable. It's your fucking fault that it's like this. Hand me the clicker, would you? Do you need another? I'm having one. It wasn't ever like this, and now it's always like this, and it's your fucking fault. It's a joke. Before, nobody could imagine it like this. and now nobody can think of anything else, and it's your, let's just leave it. But we can't just leave it, and that's your fucking fault. Not that I'm blaming it all on you. There was nothing you could really do about all of it, that is. It's not like we live in a just world, do we? The friend of my enemy's BFF, who just happens to be my boss's lapdog, and one day some drone just happens to take him out, and there's really nothing anyone could have done, so it's no one's fault, and that it's that random is your fucking fault. Hand me the clicker, would you? Once it gets dark around here, it stays dark. When did the guy say he'd be here? An hour ago, right. And he's bringing what? He's bringing Coors Light? Honestly, fuck you. I didn't order that. You're saying I ordered Coors Light. You can't be serious. Give me the clicker. Madman's on. Remember when they tried to cancel the 60s? They're always trying to cancel the 60s. The 60s are dead, deader than psychedelic rock. And whose fault is that? Whose fault is it that nature imagery pisses off my white identified neighbor? Whose fault could it possibly be, do you think? Because it didn't just happen that it'll never snow enough to cool down my being pissed off, that it's your fucking fault. Of course I walked around in my red corduroy bell-bottoms, wherever I wanted to go. I'm sure you walked around wherever you wanted in your red corduroy bell-bottoms. It wasn't as if there weren't enough red corduroy bell-bottoms to go around. That's not the point. The point is that we totally lost the 60s and all the revolutionary potential, and it's your fucking fault. It could have been anyone. We agree. Evolution is a fact. Yes, there are many, many people. Fact. Outer space exists. Fish are disappearing. The protons are fluctuating, or whatever they now say. Sky, sea, ice, changes of state. Of course, we agree. We both agree. Giant parking lots destroy manners. Patriarchy sucks the pleasures out of life at an unreplenishable rate. All of it goes without saying. So let's just shut up and wait for our fucking Coors Light. Do we agree that it didn't have to happen? Didn't. Did not have to happen. But it did. Do we? It could have been anyone, but it was you and your fucking fault. I want to agree that it did not have to happen, but I can't agree unless you agree. So what do we do now?
Thanks, Bob. Our last speaker reader is Rowan Ricardo Phillips. He's an associate professor at Stony Brook. He got his PhD at Brown, 2003. He writes poetry, he translates, he teaches history of the lyric, poetics, African American and Caribbean literatures, and he directs the Poetry Center at Stony Brook. He's the author of The Ground from 2012, which won, as far as I could count, the 2013 Whiting Writers Award, the 2013 Penn Joyce Osterweil Award for Poetry, the 2013 Great Lakes Colleges Association New Writer Award in Poetry. It was a finalist for the 2012 Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Poetry and a finalist for the NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work in Poetry. So that's pretty fabulous. He is also the author of a book of criticism, When Blackness Rhymes with Blackness, from 2010, and he's translated Salvador Espirú's Ariadne and the Grotesque Labyrinth. And he also writes for Art Forum. So please welcome Rowan Ricardo Phillips.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Sharon. I'm happy to go last because I tend to speak very briefly. So, and everything's really been fantastically covered. I'm going to keep this short and hopefully sweet. When I was first asked to participate in this, speaking of Proust, the memory immediately came to me. I think writers, emails out of the blue to do something are like their Madelines, right? And I remembered when I saw Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics that in 2000 I bumped into the editor of the third edition, Terry Brogan, the main editor. And bumping into him, I said, Terry Brogan, will you sign something for me? And I took out of my bag the 1700 page third edition of the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics. And the look on his face was of shock and, of course, pleasure. It's always pleasurable to have someone ask you to sign their book. But he also must have thought I was crazy. But I was in my third year of graduate school, maybe, and I carried that book around.
Stronger than I.
And well, that's why I wasn't when I started. But there are a few things about that book. I'm glad I'm going right after you, Bob, because there are a few things about that book and my thoughts about it that tie into what you're saying. One of them is I'm a very roll up your sleeves and chop the tree type of writer, and I appreciated its heft, not because then it had some type of authority of text. But I like lugging things around. This is why I like books. It reminds me of the work. Not so that I can whip it out and have someone think that I'm being serious, but I do like encounters with objects. I very much think that a poem is an object. And dealing with heavy text in this way reminds me of that. I also like the fact that it's ridiculously paperback. Right, if it was a hardcover book, it would be dangerous. But it's my version. I think that book was published in 1993. Is in terrible shape. You can see that it has some type of like faux plastic over the actual cover that's coming off, and the spine is broken, and the such like that. This to me is a material reminder of how the book contains within it its seeds for its own. I don't want to use the word deconstruction in this context, but kind of the seeds of its own. Failure of physicality, right? So for instance, when Bob talked about inch lengths, the first question that popped into my head was, are you including the bibliography or not?
I was. Yeah.
I love the bibliographies because they're incredibly palimpsestual, right? And I also love the fact, one of the problems I have with American poetry is how monolinguistic it tends to be. We don't dive as much into other languages as I think we should. And I love the fact, at least from the third edition, that you're going to find, especially if you look at something like the lyric, for instance, you're going to find texts in German, texts in French. And that really reminds me of the kind of bastard creature that our own language is. On top of that, there's also, when you talk about H length, I completely agree with Bob. The abbreviation in that book is absolutely insane. But if you look at something like Creole poetry, you're going to find far less abbreviation than if you look up something like the sonnet or metaphor. And so it has all of these modes to it, which also affect the length, the material of the thing that you're seeing. And in that sense, then it's a I think it's a wonderfully palimpsestic text that you're not supposed to take that seriously. I certainly don't take it that seriously. I consider it to be a reference. And given what we do, references are there to respect and disrespect to a certain extent. So I'm kind of struck by the way that we're all writers, but we're all academics. So there's a way in which reference is a job requirement. I think we all have PhDs, right?
No. Not me.
Okay, well, 4 out of 5 of us have PhDs. So there was certain time in our life, for some of us for 15 years, where reference was the mise en scène. It was everything, all right? And we're also of a certain class, being college professors, where reference also really ties into what I think is the elephant in the room, which is recreation. We're to a point now, thanks to technology, that reference also is or can be a form of recreation. This also leads to a different type of relationship to knowledge. You know, I mean, we've all been to a reading where someone says, you know, I was looking around online and I found out that there are only 2 trapezoidally shaped cells in the entire body, and I wrote a poem about that, right? I mean, we have these. In other words, reference can be incredibly recreational. It can be accidental. It doesn't anymore have. And please keep in mind, I'm not saying this in any type of evaluative nor pejorative sense. It's just, it's true. We have a completely different sense of reference now, as we should. One of the things I love about the word reference is that, at least with Romance languages, it's pretty much the same. It doesn't have any type of false friend, so it's recerca or recherche or recerca, right? But you don't, if you go across the Atlantic and you say you're doing research or interested in research, someone will know what you're saying. In writing this book, it reveals a lot of my temperament. For instance, it has no notes in it. My goal is to spend my entire life writing books of poetry without a single note in it, if I can. But at the same time, it's a book that could have tons of notes. And so when we think about reference, or when I think about reference, it's also kind of a relationship to the reader. There's something very personal about reference, or at least our search for reference. I remember reading a translation of the Metamorphoses, Rolf Humphrey's translation, and he translated the mountain ash as rowan tree. Being a Rowan, I was very much moved by that. But it's also one of the, I strangely don't have that translation at home. It's always something that I had to kind of go and look for. I'm also notorious among my friends for never copying down the library code number when I look something up. You know what's in the PNs, you know what are in the PS 3500s, you know what are in the PQs, you know what are in the N 1200s, or at least you should. And I like to I think I know where this book should be. That, in my way, is working towards a certain type of, I don't know, kind of keeping the entropy of knowledge and our learning sacrosanct and leaving it to be something that's also physically embodied. This leads to me spending more time in the library than I need to, but I like that. I like finding things by accident. I like not finding what I was looking for. I think one of the wonderful things about the Princeton Encyclopedia are its flaws. It should be flawed. It should not be comprehensive. It should strive for that type of comprehensiveness, but it should not be that. Just like I think the great poems that we try to write, or at least I hope that we try to write. I have a poem in here that I want to read. I'm going to read a couple of poems and tell you a few things about them, which I'm going to enjoy doing because I tend to not say much about my poems at all. They're short poems, relatively short poems. But this one is called Proper Names in the Lyrics of Troubadours. My parents never called me Rowan. I'm Ricky from Ricardo, but not Ricky Ricardo. I'm also the first Phillips in my family. My mother decided Philip, my father's family name, sounded too much like a first name, in America at least. Rowan Philip would lead inevitably to Philip Rowan. That was her story, and she's sticking to it. For the record, that's an Old Norse first name, a Spanish middle name, and one of those faux English, faux Dutch sounding last names that's really Greek for lover of horses. Rowan Ricardo Phillips. Another of those names that straddles seas in the sails of unseen ships. Still, it sounds typically West Indian to me. And like the West Indies, indefinite. An indefinite noun, an indefinite poem. It took me a while to accept it. So this title, Proper Names in the Lyrics of Troubadours, is actually an academic article on the troubadours. I like the title and I took it. I have a lot of encounters, I guess, with my relationship to my academic life and my creative writing life that I feel are intensely autobiographical, one of them being the simple fact that I was in graduate school in the mid-90s, and so being at Brown, it was very much like Columbia in the sense that creative writing was on one side of campus and English was on the other side of campus. And the library was in the middle. I very much, I don't miss those days, but I do like that those days and those quote-unquote culture wars and the such like that really led me to think about the good of reading, right? I'm sitting next to someone, Bob, who wrote The Marginalization of Poetry, which really actually changed my life. It's a work of criticism. You open it up, and they're couplets. The last chapter of my book of criticism, When Blackness Rhymes with Blackness, is an essay on Robert Hayden that's written in Terzarima, entirely indebted to you. I didn't give you credit, but I hope that someone would read it and pick up from that. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that when I think about writing, I really think about reference as a way into thinking about tradition. You know, when you read Milton, you're reading a lot of Virgil. When you read Stevens, you're reading a lot of Shelley. And I really like the way in which you can learn about not just poetic personality and temperament, but you can also learn, I learn in a different way, I would say more as a poet about rhyme from reading other poets. And it doesn't even have to be rhyme in the traditional sense. Plath's poem Cut, right, which has that wonderful thumb stump at the end, dirty girl, thumb stump, and the work that UMP does, which is incredibly fun, and for me it kind of cracked my head open, or I still remember the first time I saw joy and poetry rhyme together, and I don't know if it was in Dickinson or Auden. But our reading form is a type of reference, and our trips into the archives form a type of reference. I think any writer spends a lot of time thinking about what their temperament is, and what their temperament is, I think, is how they respond to larger material. Reference, of course, is the largest material that there is because it's everything that's outside of you. It implies it implies a secondary source, whether that's the weather, or whether that's Vico, or whether that's Leotard, or what have you. And so, in a sense, I just lost my train of thought. In a sense, I'm glad to have had this opportunity to think about reference, because it's something that I take for granted. I take it entirely for granted. I went to graduate school because I wanted to write a dissertation. I didn't want to be a professor in the sense that I thought that I was so far away, it could take you 6, 7, 8, however many years it takes you. It seems as though there's so many obstacles in between that if you don't just kind of love being in the archives, if you don't just love reference, you'll get tripped up on the other stuff. And I think that it took my colleagues a lot of years to even know that I wrote. You know, I was just I was at the seminar table and doing the work with everyone else, but I didn't self-fashion myself as a poetic gentleman, to kind of paraphrase on Spencer. But there's another poem I just wanted to read quickly and then maybe wrap up in that sense. This poem is called Map Incomplete, 1665. It's his vision of this piss-colored parchment with griffins cinched near the edges of the frame, as Africa, newly rivered, sits mysterious as the brain of his new world. Its synopsis as curt as enjambment, its proposed longitudes and latitudes meeting mid-ocean and forming warped crosses, wrapping around the water and blunted by these bulges in which heaven, earth, and author spell themselves out in perfect Latin. At night or at day, whichever his diary will say. A Dutch cartographer dreams, head dragging down on his desk, of Uccello's St. George and the Dragon. How, in that flat world of triangle, circle, and square, the world seemed so eager to summarize itself. Woman timed by rescue, man trapped in that stout, conning hourglass. A two-legged monster spit out from a cave in a pose so wretched he wakes to trace it. As out his window, the soft, prismatic Dutch light slowly traces its rising lover. New York. 1665 for New York is also when the Duke of York is given basically New Netherland as well as some other territories that stretch up to Maine. And I find that, I didn't research that for the poem, I just kind of read it, but I find myself constantly fascinated by how what we read kind of sticks, you know? And there's this self-directed research we have. I'm writing this book on X, thus let me do research on it. But there's a lot of reading that we do that's just kind of, you know, diaphanous secondary reading, I guess, out of pleasure. Stephen said it must change. He also said it must give pleasure. And I really love the pleasure in reference and research and the way in which it, I think, is a necessary and beautiful bridge. I don't know how much research is used outside of the world of doing what we do, but I think that research is something that's actually used quite a bit, whether or not the word itself is used. And I think that that's a really enheartening way to think about what we do in terms of our own sense of poetics also, whether it's for the federal judge, or whether it's for the software programmer, or whether it's for the elementary school teacher. It all kind of ties in and it all works. So, thanks.
Thanks. That was 5 incredibly different versions of what reference might mean to a poet, or how one might go about thinking about reference and using reference works and so forth and so on. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Is there anybody in the audience who would like to ask any question of anybody at all? Okay.
I was interested, Rowan, why you aspire to not have notes. Because it's easy not to have notes, you just don't put the notes in. But what is it? Because I had this discussion with students and other poets about notes. So what was your desire not to have that?
The question was, let me just repeat, the question was why the desire not to have notes? Yeah.
Well, I mean, for me, it puts pressure on my poems, and I like pressure on my poems. It also, my last day at Brown, I think it was right before graduation, but it was like the last day I had to do something or something. And Len Tenenhouse had his arm on my shoulder, and then he put it around the other shoulder, and he went, "You're a modernist, you know. You're a modernist." And he didn't mean that in a nice way. But I like the pressure I like the pressure that not having notes puts on you to be clear in the way you want to be clear without falling back on this notion of it will cohere, right? Or for instance, I didn't mention 1665 or where the title from the other poem came from to add value to the poem. To me, it was a moment of kind of intimacy with the audience. But I like the idea that I can't explain my way out of it. I very much believe in the lyric, and the lyric is, to me, what's there, right? Yeah. And it is easy, I'm sorry, and it is easy to, it's not as easy to not put notes in your poem, because for instance, when your editor says, your book needs notes, right? Then it's not as easy, right?
I was just going to say, how can you be a modernist if you don't have notes, you know?
Well, in the sense that it will cohere, right? Like, in the sense that there are no notes, but all of this has a great clarity to it when you read the whole book. It makes sense, right?
Anybody else? Yes?
This is a question for anyone. Do you ever find that the assumption that any reader can look up anything that you're writing about that might be obscure or difficult short circuits the poem or makes the editing process different or more difficult because of this assumption that the reader can have access to any information that's like loaded into the poem?
Is there a summary of that one?
That there's no more private special associations, that everything is public in a way. Is that what you're? Yes. Yeah. I think that, I mean, that is true, but my experience writing and teaching sort of points in the other direction, which is that I think to generalize a group of consciousness is often it's quite various and full of arbitrary new information, but that in fact I'm finding that people know less and less. I don't mean that in a it's sort of a dour way that people should read Milton and they don't, but just that ordinary reference that I thought would be very obvious. I'm just seeing it kind of fall to the wayside. That the entropy of accumulating present tense information and how much that overloads common past libraries, whether they are avant-garde or Eleotic, whatever. It's a very striking phenomenon. And yes, people could look up whatever, but that kind of assiduous desire to find out every little detail is a very rare phenomenon. So I guess my answer is that I think it goes the other way, that you have to sort of bring your references with you into the present tense of the poem if you want it to be received. Just my own feeling. I don't know if you folks feel differently about that.
I guess my thought on that is that for me a poem is like a really specific aesthetic, sensual structure, and reference is kind of secondary to that. So I think I'm a little bit indifferent as to whether they can or want to look. I mean, I'm glad there's access, and I wouldn't want to have some kind of secret privileged knowledge, although I suppose that secret privileged knowledge does come in terms of my own knowledge world and sensorium that people are never going to have access to.
Anybody else? Any other questions? We could probably take one more. Yeah.
Trying to tie in with the idea of shutting people out with references or not trying to make them accessible. How do you find it more difficult to use, say, scientific texts as reference points? Referencing something, because sometimes I just, for the fun of it, read a recent science book. Trying to reference something like a Feigenbaum number might be a little odd in a poem. And almost, unless you use the text to explain it somehow or create a reference, it's going to be something they're going to have to look up. Do you find using science as a reference? Because a lot of people talk about trying to bridge that gap between what science is doing now and the arts.
I think for me, I find it easier to not have any knowledge of what's going on in a text and use it for a poem, because I think I can have the wonder again at the structure of the language without being bogged down in meaning. And I think that, for example, a science textbook would usually be that kind of place for me in writing my own poems. But I don't think he's in here. Nick, are you in here? I just had a student workshop a poem. He did an erasure of an old math textbook, and it was called Love Ballad from, he's gonna love that this is a Love Ballad from Walter Rudin the 10th or something like that. And it was and I was like, oh boy, I'm a real idiot. I don't know who this poet Walter Rudin is, I'm gonna look like a fool. But we found out that it was this old mathematician, and he had, lifted language and taken out. And it was interesting because it seemed like he wanted to adhere the meaning to the fact that it was a math textbook, to try to give a key to the reader in some way. There are words like computer, I think, or computation. So it was just a really interesting conversation thinking about that in the space of creating that poem, and what could you substitute for that language that would be very much part of the conversation of whatever was happening in that book, to convey whatever, I don't know if you want to say emotionally, but whatever the trajectory was of the point Walter Rudin was trying to make.
The poet who, I was just with Ray Armentrout, who was just reading Downtown, and she strikes me as the poet who is serious in her reading of science to a really great extent. And just one of her recent poems, one word that sticks in my brain, it's about chirality, which is handedness. And she was reading some physicist and not quite understanding it, but she could actually talk to the guy, her colleague in San Diego. And maybe it turns out that light is right-handed. It has to do with symmetry and time going forwards and backwards and many things that I don't think too many of us here understand. And she used chirality in the poem and had to explain it to the audience, sort of explained it, but at the same time it remained unexplained, I think, because it isn't part of our sensory, emotional, experiential experience. And a lot of science really does bypass the sensorium, and I think all of us agree that poetry, in its kind of wretched Cinderella-like old-fashionedness, has to address the sensorium, where science leaps over that. So I think the two cultures thing that Snow said 75 years ago, science and literature, I think it's a really big gap. And there's very few people, Lucretius, maybe, it's really hard to bridge it, because you have to bridge it, you have to somehow bring it over to the sensorium, whether you're reading for, taste and or aesthetic full pleasure or glancing unfullness, whatever it's still the sensorium that's addressed, and science just bypasses that in so many ways. So it's a tough question.
Tom, did you want to?
Well, this is sort of on a sidetrack a little bit, but sort of, I've been, again, thinking about sort of just digital reading practices in general, and, you have sort of F-pattern reading that's taking place in a sort of web environment, or you're getting, the Google golden triangle. When you see a web page, you're going to read in very particular ways, and there's a lot of
Can you explain the F pattern?
Yeah, I'm just
So F pattern is you're going to read along that left column, and you're going to read along the top line, and you're going to read somewhere in the middle. So you're basically skimming for content. And so high literacy reading is sort of characterized more by that kind of skimming procedure, and lower literacy reading is sort of marked by plowing. So there you're reading sort of through a lot of text, and then you're jumping to another textual module. So, the sort of scientific references that sort of may be on the surface of a text are probably not going to be examined more closely, sort of under the aegis of a digital read. So I find that a lot of the paratextual matter, the notes that we were talking about earlier, would have to be somehow incorporated within the body of the work. So you're going to have the sort of source text, and then you're going to have the sort of metadata or the sort of paratextual material that helps you understand it. With, I think, the understanding that the reading procedure involves putting together material in a way that generates meaning. And I feel that a lot of this stuff is sort of being prioritized, with a lot of sort of post-conceptual works, stuff like that. And there is like a lot of scientific material out there. I'm thinking of people like Kieran Daly, who's been writing on null appropriation, and Françoise Laruelle. That's all in there. It's impenetrable. And there is this kind of apparatus for getting at it, and a table of contents, and all these sort of old-fashioned bibliographic devices that might be useful in unpacking meaning from a text that has been aggregated. So you have a lot of aggregation of other texts.
But isn't that positing some super reader? A super reader would get that meaning and do that work, but one has to wait for the super reader, like some millennial event that is never going to happen.
Yes, I agree. There's a lot of mystery then that inheres in that kind of text. And I don't know if that's a kind of sublimity or not, but certainly one could make an argument that, we're going to give you the source text, and we're going to give you a little bit of the apparatus for decoding it. There you have a sort of cryptic, poetic utterance again, returning. and that sort of mystery in the data is maybe an interesting place to linger. And that would, yes, that would be based on what I would call a lazy reader, yeah. A lazy sublimity.
Also, quite quickly, there's been science in poetry for a very long time. It's just that, you know, when the science turns out to be wrong, then it's not science anymore, right? Like Donne, valediction, or yeah, I mean, John Donne was so into alchemy and everything, and like most of it was wrong. I was born and raised here, and now I have a 2-year-old, and I take her to the Museum of Natural History, and the horror, everything I knew about paleontology as a kid was wrong, right? So there's a way in which I think one of the elegant things about poetry is the way in which it can still consume these types of knowledges, right? And then you have questions about the work of the pre-Socratic philosophers, Empedocles, et cetera. I mean, that's science, right? Or Dryden in Harmony and Heavenly Harmony, this heavenly frame began, and this universal frame began, and, old cosmologies and Dante's trippy map of heaven, right? It's just that they stop being science and they start being a type of, aesthetics, whether we want to call them aesthetics or not. I don't know.
Okay, I think that's it. Weirdly, I feel like we're just getting started. I kind of wish this is where we would begin, but anyway, thank you very much for coming, and